Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. The Giza Plateau has an incredibly long and complicated history, and regarding the Great Pyramid specifically, many people make the mistake in assuming it is just one structure built at one time for one purpose. But the pyramid clearly wasn't built according to one architectural plan, and there were numerous phases of construction, through different eras of history by different architects. Nobody can look at the subterranean chamber, well shaft and grotto and tell me that the architect who designed the Grand Gallery also designed these features. Features I'll be looking into more in my next video. Historians and alternative researchers spend so much time arguing about whether or not the Great Pyramid was the tomb of the Pharaoh Khufu, when the answer is yes, it probably was. But that doesn't mean it was the Great Pyramid's original and only function, just that this was one of its many uses through the long and turbulent history of Egypt. It was built in multiple phases over thousands of years and was added to and modified as new rulers stamped their mark on the sacred landscape, changing the function and purpose of this and every Giza pyramid. As I showed in a recent video, remains of a bull were found in the sarcophagus in the Khafre Pyramid. The pyramid was irrefutably the final resting place and tomb of a bull. But of course, nobody in their right mind believes this is the reason why the ancient Egyptians built the second largest pyramid in Egypt. What this find shows us is that the Khafre Pyramid, at some point in its long history, was once used for this purpose. It was the tomb of a bull. But this was clearly its final purpose and not the original, and that brings me to the subject of this video. What state was the Giza Plateau in when chroniclers like Herodotus and Pliny started documenting the land of Egypt? Many think that all three of the Giza pyramids are today in a somewhat similar form to how they looked when originally built, minus the casing stones, forgetting the long and complicated history of Egypt from the start of the dynastic era through to the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC. The mound under the Great Pyramid, which was worked to incorporate the subterranean chamber and descending passageway, I believe is phase 1 of the pyramid's history, most likely in pre-dynastic times. Whether or not the pyramid itself is 4th dynasty in age or far older is of course a long-running debate and not for this video, but it had certainly been constructed by Old Kingdom times. Khufu was certainly associated with it too, whether as a builder or renovator, but whether or not he was ever entombed inside we'll probably never know. By the end of the Old Kingdom, I believe the Great Pyramid was closed up, with the granite plugs released into the ascending corridor and the entrance closed. Giza seems to have come back to prominence in the New Kingdom, and with the onset of the 18th dynasty came the emergence of the cult of the Sphinx, aka Horon-Horemheb, which also saw major building projects, including 1 or possibly 2 Sphinx temples to the northeast of the monument. At this time it was a site of pilgrimage and a focal point of the elite. With so much activity around the Great Sphinx, the pyramids could not have gone unnoticed, and it was possibly during this time when the well shaft was dug from the descending passageway to the Grand Gallery, but this of course is open to debate. Some think that the well shaft was dug to access the upper compartments in later history after the granite plugs had been released. But with the current state of knowledge, we don't know exactly when the crude well was dug. It was either way before or way after the pyramid was complete in my opinion. We know from looking at the Dream Stealer between its paws that the Sphinx was covered in sand until Thutmose IV, then a prince, uncovered it. This shows that the monument was certainly neglected for quite some time, and we can assume that Giza as a whole also suffered a similar fate. But we know that in the 18th dynasty, the Sphinx underwent huge amounts of restoration work. Much of the masonry that was added to the Sphinx, known as Phase 1 in the restoration work, comes from the 18th dynasty, as were the 5 masonry boxes that surrounded it, all of which I've discussed in my previous video. Giza was back under the spotlight in ancient Egypt, and as well as the work that was done to the Sphinx, I would guess that the interior spaces of the Great Pyramid were reopened and restored. This is when I think the structure was possibly reused for initiation and ritual ceremonies by the 18th dynasty priests and pharaohs. This is because from the 18th dynasty to around 500 BC, the Egyptian Book of the Dead was reworked over and over again, and as Robert Schoch says in his book Pyramid Quest, the Book of the Dead was being retooled as a liturgy for use in the Great Pyramid. He goes on to say that accordingly, as time passed, the book came to resemble more and more the interior of the Great Pyramid itself. This all implies that the pyramid became a structure used for ritual and initiation, with the Book of the Dead evolving as the function of the pyramid evolved alongside it. The final version of the Book of the Dead dates to the 26th dynasty, a time of economic prosperity in Egypt, and known as the Sate period due to its devotion to Isis at the Temple of Sais. It was during the Sate period when we saw the resurgence of the cult of Khufu, and this is surely no coincidence because it was at this time when the Great Pyramid and the entire Giza Plateau once again became a major focal point in Egypt. The Sate period is what I am calling the last days of Giza, and although the Persians, Romans, Greeks and Arabs all had a presence thereafter, going into all three pyramids and building stairways, statues and stelae around the Sphinx, the Sate period was the last true ancient Egyptian age of the pyramids. As I've discussed on my channel from day one, there are many unknowns regarding Giza, but to understand what we are looking at today, we really need to know how the dynastic Egyptians left the Sphinx and the pyramids, and therefore the 26th dynasty is an extremely important time period to understand. It was a time when Psamtik I unified a fragmented Egypt and made it independent from Assyrian rule. Huge amounts of construction work took place at Giza, and new pharaohs left their mark all over the plateau. There are numerous rock-cut tombs found close to the Causeway of Khafre and the Great Sphinx, including a commander of the royal army named Ahmose, and his mother, Queen Nectabastro, who was the wife of Pharaoh Amasis II. Most of the artefacts found inside the famous Tomb of Osiris, including pottery shards, ceramic beads, ushabtis and basalt sarcophagi, have been stylistically dated to the 26th dynasty, although the tomb was likely dug in far earlier times. The same can be said with Campbell's tomb, a huge pit just west of the Sphinx, which most believe was dug in ancient times, yet the finds inside show that it was in use in the Sate period. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that the Sate period was a time of high activity at Giza, and as well as new constructions and rock-cut tombs, every single existing structure seems to have been reoccupied and in places reworked by the new ruling dynasty. The most famous relic from the Sate period that has long caused controversy in Egyptological circles is of course the inventory stela. Many have long believed it is Old Kingdom in origin, but it is certainly 26th dynasty in form and style. Not to mention it refers to the Sphinx as Horon, which was a name that didn't become associated with the Sphinx until the New Kingdom. It also mentions a number of deities that were not known in Old Kingdom times. Found by Auguste Mariette in the 19th century, the stela is controversial as it implies that the Sphinx was already present in the reign of Khufu, whereas Egyptologists tell us that Khafre, who came after Khufu, was the pharaoh who created the Sphinx. But the only association between Khafre and the Sphinx is a partial and incomplete inscription on the 18th dynasty Dream Stela. But why a New Kingdom stela is any more credible than one from the Sate period is unknown to me, especially as both were created many hundreds of years after the 4th dynasty, and therefore neither stela is a primary source. During the Sate period, a temple of Isis was built next to Henetsen's pyramid on the eastern flank of the Great Pyramid, and there is clear evidence that there was activity inside the pyramids as well. When Howard Weiss gained entry into the Menkaure pyramid in the 19th century, he discovered a wooden anthropoid coffin inscribed with Menkaure's name in the upper antechamber. The wooden coffin still exists in the British Museum, and through carbon dating and also due to its style, it is believed to be Sate period in origin. But this coffin is thought to be a decoy, created by the Sate people to stop tomb robbers from searching for the stone sarcophagus and the true resting place of the pharaoh, and there does seem to be evidence to back this up. It comes from the credible Arab chronicler Al-Adrizi, the man who also claimed there was once a sarcophagus and hieroglyphs inside the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. In his writings he accurately describes the interior of Menkaure's pyramid and says that the Sherif Bu el-Hossein told him that inside the stone sarcophagus in the Menkaure pyramid were the rotten remains of a man as well as golden tablets inscribed with characters of a language that nobody could understand. Each workman took a share of the tablets as payment for their work, and they have never been seen since. Most people would dismiss the notion of golden tablets in the sarcophagus of an Old Kingdom king because such a thing is unheard of, but they would be unwise in my opinion. No, putting small gold tablets inside a sarcophagus wasn't an Old Kingdom tradition, but it was one of the Sate period and beyond. Known as Orphic gold tablets, these seem to be an ancient Greek tradition, but the practice shows strong similarities to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in terms of associated imagery and symbolism. During the 6th century BC, with the Saint Pharaohs in control, the Book of the Dead underwent a revival in Egypt, with further edits and additions on top of those made in the 18th dynasty. Many spells were updated and include Orphic imagery and influence. Herodotus and other Greeks noted that Orphic traditions existed in Egypt at this time, and I believe that what Al-Adrizi was told about gold tablets inside the Menkaure sarcophagus is an Orphic addition by the Sate priests. These gold tablets will be just like the ones found inside what was the famous unopened sarcophagus that was discovered in Alexandria last year. Whilst the media attention went to people wanting to drink the toxic liquid inside, most don't know that as well as bones, a small number of Orphic gold tablets were also discovered inside. So, I deduce that the Sate priests placed Orphic gold tablets inside the true sarcophagus in the pyramid's burial chamber, and also created a wooden decoy coffin with Menkaure's name etched onto it, and placed it inside the antechamber so that any successful tomb robbers would think they have found the king and would therefore stop their search. What we learn from this, from the inscribed wooden coffin and the gold tablets, is that in the Sate period, the Egyptians believed that Menkaure was laid to rest inside the 3rd Giza Pyramid, and the inventory stela also shows that they associated the pharaoh Khufu with Giza. The Sate period came after a series of major upheavals for the country, and it wasn't about re-establishing Egypt as an international power, but more about sheer survival as a nation. They were, in effect, fortifying their culture, bringing back the long and rich traditions and making it great once again. They were returning Giza to its former splendour, being respectful to the gods, and any royal remains found inside the pyramids were obviously treated with the utmost respect. As mentioned in a recent video, it is actually no surprise that the remains of a bull were placed in the Khafre Pyramid, something that screams out as the handiwork of the Sate priests. The cult of the Apis bull that had been prominent since early dynastic times became even more important in the late period. The first king of the 26th dynasty had major renovation work done at the famous Serapeum of Saqqara, and many royal stela were created to honour the Apis bulls. Here is one example dedicated by King Amasis II to an Apis bull that died during his reign. The stela reads that the bull was dragged on a sledge to its tomb. It was placed in a granite sarcophagus commissioned by the king, who also provided the shroud, amulets and funerary furniture. Prior to the Sate period, Serapeum stela were dedicated by private individuals, but now kings were also making dedications to the Apis bulls. Therefore a bull laid to rest inside the Khafre Pyramid isn't quite so strange, and was actually a very fitting resting place for a sacred animal held in such high honour. What happened in the Great Pyramid at this time, we simply don't know. But as the Book of the Dead was clearly edited in New Kingdom times to resemble the interior of this pyramid, as Robert Schoch says, and as the book was once again of high importance in Egypt in the Sate period, as was the cult of Khufu, I would suggest that the Great Pyramid was at the centre of religious rites. Sais, which was the capital city, was devoted to Isis, and the fact that a new Temple of Isis was built on the flanks of the Great Pyramid cannot go unnoticed. So, what of the Sphinx? Herodotus doesn't mention it, but there is no doubt that in the Sate period it was held in high regard due to the huge amounts of esteemed burials that surround it, not just a queen but also princes and high priests. Furthermore, a number of Sate kings depicted themselves as sphinxes, just like all of the 18th dynasty kings did before them. I would suggest that the kings of the Sate period removed any accumulated sand around it, and returned the Sphinx to its original splendour. And we also have a huge amount of evidence because the Phase 2 Sphinx restoration work is all dated to the Sate period. Furthermore, the inventory stela indicates the Sphinx was repaired at this time. The main restoration work was the addition of masonry on the upper part of the Sphinx body on the south side, as well as reconstructing the tail, and they often laid blocks over the Phase 1 masonry from the 18th dynasty to do so. But one thing that I find particularly interesting is that the Sate kings also restored the Nemes headdress of the Sphinx, and the reason I think this is important is because after reviewing sculptures of the 26th dynasty pharaohs, I think they may have recarved the face as well. Anybody who has looked at the Sphinx has noticed a somewhat knowing smirk on its face, something that I actually find hard to describe, but hopefully you know what I mean. looking back through old literature, and I remember what Howard Weiss said in his trilogy of books on Giza, where he mentions that Pliny the Elder states that the body of Amasis was placed inside the Sphinx, who he says is the first king of the 18th dynasty. This is highly unlikely, and even I disregarded this as mere fiction. But after paying more attention to the Sate period, there was of course a pharaoh called Amasis II, who reigned between 570 and 526 BC. He was the last great ruler of Egypt before the Persian conquest. He was originally an officer in the Egyptian army, and then a general who the soldiers rallied behind to overthrow the failing King Apries. He and his soldiers were successful in their revolt, and Amasis was proclaimed king by the rebels whilst Apries fled to Babylon, but was later killed trying to regain power. Amasis then married the former king's own daughter to legitimise his kingship. The historian Herodotus states that under his prudent administration, Egypt reached new levels of wealth. He adorned the temples of Lower Egypt with splendid monolithic shrines and other monuments. He also married a Greek princess, who was one of his many wives, which helped to build strong diplomatic relations. The agricultural economy reached its zenith, and Herodotus, who went to Egypt less than a century after his death, said that under the rule of King Amasis II, the country attained its highest level of prosperity. He even defeated the Babylonians in battle, but died in 526 BC, just years before the Persian invasion. It is said he was buried at the royal necropolis of Sais, but his tomb has never been discovered. But is this because the Great Sphinx was actually the tomb of this great general and pharaoh? What Pliny the Elder said specifically is that the inhabitants of the region regard the Sphinx as a deity, and they said that King Amasis is buried inside, and there is some evidence to say that this idea is credible. The great royal wife of Amasis II, Queen Nectabastero, was buried in rock-cut tomb G9550, inside a black granite sarcophagus that now stands in St. Petersburg. She was buried with her son, also called Amasis or Ahmose, who was an army general. She held the titles King's Wife, His Beloved, Great One of the Het's Scepter, and Great of Praises. Tomb G9550 is a stone's throw away from the Great Sphinx, and was this because her powerful husband, one of the greatest kings Egypt had seen in a very long time, a man who made Egypt prosper like in days gone by, was actually buried inside the Sphinx? As stated in previous videos, when the Sphinx was being renovated in the early 20th century, there was a room found inside, accessed through the large fissure, but connected by an excavated tunnel in the rear, a tunnel that is now sealed due to the huge amount of cement that was poured in back in the early 20th century. Inside the room were the remains of a wooden coffin with resin used in mummification, but sadly there was little else. Is this all that remained of King Amasis II? Or, in actual fact, is this what remains of him? Was his face put onto the Great Sphinx? In its final incarnation, in the final days of Giza, was the Sphinx the tomb of Amasis II, as Pliny says, and is his likeness the one we can all see today? There is a Sphinx statue of Amasis that was recovered, so the idea isn't unheard of, and it also has that same knowing look about it as seen on the Great Sphinx. Stylistically, the faces do look similar in my opinion, and no, it isn't worth comparing the two statues like for like in great detail, because if you compare any two statues of any Egyptian pharaoh, they all look somewhat different. But in terms of a hypothesis for whose face we see on the Sphinx, I think it is worthy of consideration. With all the work of the Sate kings on the Giza Plateau, and if the greatest of the Sate kings was buried inside the Sphinx, maybe their final act of renovation was to carve the face of their greatest general, the most successful pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, on their greatest and most iconic monument, so his legacy could last an eternity. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.